The board could leverage their land holdings within the Sacramento-San Joaquin Drainage District to find deeper collaboration with state and federal land management agencies. And what that could do is reduce O&M costs and streamline permitting for flood system maintenance. And I think there's some great progress being made on this right now. And then as Aisha described, we can integrate with other funds. So greenhouse gas reduction funds or SGMA are classic examples. We could optimize federal pre-disaster mitigation fund usage as well for multi-benefit projects. All of these are things that at River Partners we're investigating, but as a broader community, your conservation partners and NGOs can help to figure out each of these. The permitting is the other major obstacle that I wanted to address today, and considering what we've heard about the San Joaquin system all day, I want to thank the board for their continued interest in identifying a process to work with us in the Army Corps to deal with the obsolete levies issue. We still have a lot of progress to make, but we're working on it. At Three Amigos, which is a project that was broadly supported by this board back when it was known as the Reclamation Board, and the Army Corps and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and many, many other agencies, after 22 years and $56 million in competitive funds, the site is fully restored. It's completely protected. It's got flowage easements over the whole site, and it's reconnected to the river. But somehow the maintenance manuals for those levees still reflect the conditions as when the levees were certified in 1958. Continuing to inspect and threatening to issue violations for unpermitted encroachments on these levees is beyond counterproductive. I really believe that to find resiliency for our flood system, we have to find a way to complete the paperwork to modify the purpose of obsolete levees. I'm excited to announce to you today that River Partners is walking the walk on this topic of improving permitting. We're currently reaching out to resource managers throughout the San Joaquin Valley to discuss the potential to lead the development of a RCIS for the San Joaquin River and its tributaries and floodplains. We're still early in the process, but so far the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. An RCIS would allow the flood management agencies to negotiate advanced mitigation crediting agreements. Those could substantially reduce costs and improve timelines. An RCIS could also support more comprehensive habitat conservation and management, which will contribute to the objectives of the conservation strategy and recover wildlife populations from the brink of extinction. Our RCIS may even be able to support needed flood system improvements that are outside the footprint of the State Plan of Flood Control, where people and property are at significant risk of flood damages and the board's authorities are limited. As you know, the 408 permit process has been a major barrier to implementing projects. River Partners is hopeful that recent reforms leading to the district level categorical permissions will reduce further unnecessary project delays for multi-benefit projects. And we look forward to working with the board on processing 408 permits under that new process. But I'll caveat that we anticipate the modification or removal of obsolete levies is going to require more attention from board staff and legal. Finally, I have to talk a little bit about CEQA. Multi-benefit flood management projects produce benefits for multiple parties, multiple generations across the entire state of California. Local interests, interests from afar, and interests of the public in general. Even so, it's usually quite difficult to find an agency willing to serve as a CEQA lead for a project. Without a CEQA lead agency, it's almost impossible to even obtain planning funds to advance good ideas. So, I encourage this board to further explore and expand its capacities to serve this important function for flood system improvements. I'm delighted at the progress that's been made so far, and I think we can do more. Serving as a CEQA lead agency could support the 2017 update and expedite the delivery of more resiliency projects across the Central Valley in meaningful ways. Thank you for the opportunity to address you today. As always, I'm happy to talk with any of you to further describe this exciting work that we have to accomplish together to fully implement the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan and deliver a more resilient water system for the residents of California. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Easy peasy recommendations. We'll get there. Hopefully we can improve the timeline of 22 years.
Next, I'd like to invite up Barry Nelson from the Golden Gate Salmon Association.
Hi, Barry Nelson with the Golden Gate Salmon Association. My colleagues showed you pretty pictures. It's my job to give you the paper. So I'm going to hand these out.
Love to read.
So I have a summary of our recommendations for the audience and a longer version for you folks and one graphic that I'm going to draw your attention to, which is why I didn't do a PowerPoint.
Good. Thank you.
So again, I'm with the Golden Gate Salmon Association. When you look at the document I just handed out with our recommendations, you'll notice that the GGSA logo is not on there yet. You should conclude from that we haven't had our meeting. So we'll add more logos. We've been moving fast to get these recommendations to you for the governor's portfolio planning process. So first, I'd like to start with an introduction to the Golden Gate Salmon Association, why we care so much about flood management in California, and then give an overview of the flood study group's recommendations. So just wanted to start by observing that the Golden Gate Salmon Association is not an environmental group. We're a business organization. We consist of California's salmon fishing industry. Our board consists of commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, folks who run the charter boats. I was out on one of those a couple of days ago. Restaurant owners, folks who manufacture fishing gear and sell the fishing gear. We have a tribal board member. That industry is $1.4 billion a year when that industry is healthy, not even fully restored, but 20 years ago when it was healthier, generates over 23,000 jobs in California. It's a significant, but until a decade ago, an often overlooked industry. We exist. GGSA exists because in 2008 and 2009, our industry was shut down. It was illegal to catch salmon in the state of California for 2 years. All of those people who depend on salmon were out of a job. And we now, GGSA exists because we know that the future of our industry is quite literally at stake. 2008, 2009 were disastrous, a real wake-up call for our industry. The last several years have been bad. This year is quite a bit better, and I want to talk a little bit about why that is. This year is better. I was out fishing a couple of days ago and came home with a couple of salmon. We're having our neighbors over for dinner tonight. So to people all over California, salmon's a big deal, not just because it's an iconic species, but because it's a sustainable, healthy, nutritious local food source in California that's enormously valued by the public. So the problem we face is that we occasionally have great salmon years, and especially in the last couple of years, we have had a lot of disastrous salmon years. So I just want to present one chart to you that shows the dramatic rise and fall of salmon in the last 25 years in California. If you go back, I was going to bring you a second graphic that shows what this graph looks like prior to the 80s, and it's a much more stable graph. These three big peaks you see in the early 90s, 2008, 2009, and in the last couple of years, those are the three biggest crises in the history of salmon fishing in California. They're a real warning sign that something's happening to our salmon fishery and that something's happening to our rivers. So why this rise and fall? If you look at this graphic, you'll see that in 2011, we saw a bump. We saw a 2011 bump because of a wet season a couple years earlier. We saw the same thing in the early 2000s. We're seeing an increase in production this year. Reason for that is actually pretty simple. We haven't treated our rivers terribly well. Our salmon do far better when there's water in our rivers. But it's worth taking a moment. So in droughts, after our droughts, salmon populations crash. Ellen Hannock's work during the drought showed that the natural resources of the state were the sector of the state most hard hit during the drought. So why do we do so much better in wetter years? It's worth looking at the mechanisms there. One is lower temperatures. Ellen talked about temperature impacts. Another is reduced transport time for juvenile salmon finding the way to the ocean, less risk of their being caught in agricultural and urban water facilities and so forth. Another issue is reduced predation losses. The higher flows mean higher turbidity, but for you folks in particular, it means more access to riparian vegetation, to floodplain habitat, where there's a greater ability to hide from predators and have a greater survival rate. And Jacob Katz is going to be talking after me, and he will no doubt talk with you about floodplain fatties and improved food production. So what's the key to, one of the keys to improving the sustainability of the salmon fishery is trying to extend those benefits to other years. That's hard in some areas, but it's easier in others. And about half of the benefits I just ran through from high flows, we can duplicate through smart floodplain projects. It means we can squeeze habitat benefits out of our system in non-flood years. That, simply put, is why the salmon fishing community is interested in these flood issues. We can reduce predation losses, we can increase food production, we can increase the size and the health and the number of fish that make it out of the ocean and that are caught by our fishery and come back and spawn several years later. That's why we're here. We haven't spent as much time working with your board as some of the other flood study group members, but we've been quite involved in things like improvements in the Yolo bypass, some flood projects on the Feather River, and a number of other projects. We hope to see many more projects on the Feather, on the Yuba, on the Sacramento, on the San Joaquin, in the Sutter Basin, and elsewhere. That's why we're here. For decades in California, we built traditional dam and levee projects that were disastrous for salmon. We now have a different flood paradigm thanks to your hard work. A flood paradigm that focuses on multi-benefits, that relies on a conservation strategy, that shows how we can protect public safety while we're restoring all of the other public benefits that Aisha talked about. And you have helped establish California very much as a national and a global leader on these flood management issues. So the discussion here about flood issues is not what the right approach is so much as it is how do we accelerate, how do we do this on the scale that we know we need to in order to achieve the benefits that we need, both public safety and other multiple benefits. That's what our recommendations are all about. So you have the recommendations that have been developed by the Flood Study Group. My job is to be the utility infielder. I'm going to run through this framework that we've developed and not spend time on the issues that my colleagues have discussed. So there are 5 areas I just want to very briefly run through, and I hope you have your pens out so we can talk some, not just with me, but with my colleagues who are involved in developing these recommendations. First of those, Mr. Countryman, you talked about this earlier, the need to really focus on the San Joaquin side of the system. Your flood plan in 2017 shows the potential for up to an 80%, almost a doubling of flows on the San Joaquin system. It's not a very effective system today, and the risks on the San Joaquin are going to be greater. If we look toward the bottom of that system, communities like Stockton and others, big communities, small communities, are the subject of significant risk today. That risk is going to grow. Those communities also, many of them are economically disadvantaged communities, and we believe, and they're highly diverse communities. We think that your leadership is going to be really essential to make sure that we tackle those flood strategies on the San Joaquin in order to integrate projects like Paradise Cut that Julie mentioned, the projects, the multi-benefit projects in the middle San Joaquin that we know we can put together to integrate the full reach of the Sacramento from Friant Dam all the way down to the Delta. That's a big river, it's a diverse area. We think your leadership on that issue, on developing a real effective big strategy for the San Joaquin is going to be essential. Next, integrating your work with other areas. Aisha talked about that, so I won't spend more time about Sigma and Flood Board and Water Board and other programs where we think there's a lot of potential for synergies. The one recommendation I'll mention briefly is that we recognize, it's easy in theory to recognize the opportunities to integrate these programs, but drilling down and doing it on the ground in a practical way is not an easy thing to do. We recognize that challenge. And one of our recommendations is to put together a Blue Ribbon panel to talk about integration. We've got the FloodMar effort that's looking at research opportunities, but we're talking here more about really talking about the nuts and bolts of integrating your program, the Sigma program, and other programs where we know there are some synergies around multi-benefit projects. Third set of recommendations is about permitting and funding. The way we've talked about dollars, by the way, our third set of recommendations is about funding. That's how agencies push dollars out the door. Our fourth set of recommendations is about financing. It's where the money comes from. So the third is pushing it out. The fourth set is about where that money comes from. Julie talked about decommissioning, funding from DWR, about the RCIS process. The one issue I'll mention here, we believe that one of the other important issues for permitting, planning, and funding projects is to increase the flood board's independence in terms of controlling your own budget effectively and hiring and so forth, and providing early input on capital and maintenance projects. We think having a fully independent flood board is a really important issue. Fourth set of recommendations is about financing. Again, this is where the money comes from. Julie talked about a number of those issues. She mentioned the San Joaquin River, Sacramento-San Joaquin Drainage District. Aisha also mentioned greenhouse gas and Sigma funding. Two other issues I want to touch on. You saw actually when you looked at the mix of funds that River Partners has relied on for some of their projects, the state is an enormously important partner. Your flood plan projects roughly $20 billion in needed investments in the next couple of decades. The good news is when California writes and passes bonds, multi-benefit flood projects are now part of that. They were in the last bond approved by the voters. Multi-benefit projects are included in SB 45, which is being considered by the legislature right now. The challenge is that we're funding that work at the level of a couple of $100 million. Every dollar is appreciated, but if you look at the scale of investments we know we need to make, we're going to need to make sure that those bonds contain more funds for multi-benefit funding. We have recommended $1 billion in the next bond to address these critical flood management issues. Fifth, something that Aisha touched on briefly, and that's ensuring appropriate uses in funding. I don't need to tell you folks about SB 5. That's a bill that established the board as you exist today, helped produce the flood plan that you adopted a couple of years ago. As you also know, SB 5 prohibits development of floodplains that don't have 200-year flood protection, except where findings are made about adequate progress. And as you know, those findings are made by local governments. We're under enormous pressure to produce, to authorize developments. And as Aisha mentioned, often lack the expertise that's necessary in order to make these findings in a good way. So we're a decade in, more than 12 years into implementation of SB 5. How are those local agencies doing in making those critical determinations about flood protection? Truth is, we don't know. We have some anecdotal information that some communities are doing well and some not so well. But we think we're a decade in, and it's important to just step back and evaluate how those agencies are doing in making those determinations about progress towards providing adequate flood protection for those communities. We make no assumptions about what that evaluation will produce across the valley, will conclude, or what action, if any action, is necessary. But the stakes here, as we all know, are high when you look across the nation and look at what's happened to New Orleans, Houston, New Jersey, New York, the upper Midwest, what could have happened in New Orleans again this year. And we know that the Central Valley is one of the regions in the country most at risk. And we know that we need to do everything we can do in order to keep making critical progress on this issue. So I just want to close by saying that both the flood plan and the growth of multi-benefit projects in California over the last several years show a distinct new flood management era has begun in California. And it's been easy for the public and decision makers to miss that really important transition. But it really is a truly historic change. A lot of transition in California on water issues are painful and often involve extended fights. That's not true on flood issues. We have transitioned to the multi-benefit paradigm in a way that has been enormously collaborative. You, your staff, deserve an enormous amount of credit for that. So do the legislators who pushed this process initially with SB 5. So also do the stakeholders who have collaborated, as you heard from the advisory committee earlier, have collaborated so well in this process. And as I said, the challenge here is not what the right approach is. The flood plan points in that direction. The challenge is making sure that we can scale up so that projects don't take 22 years to be implemented. And that's what our recommendations are designed to help do, to drill down some into the details and figure out how we can make more rapid progress. And then finally, as you heard, especially from Aisha, we started developing these recommendations before the portfolio process was outlined by the administration. But the multi-benefit process and our recommendations really track the portfolio process enormously well. We think they really are a natural fit. So as your agency puts together suggestions for the administration in that team effort to develop those portfolio recommendations, that portfolio approach, we hope you'll consider our recommendations and for the ones along that you think could be helpful. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I, for one, appreciate that you wrote this out. It allows a little bit more learning. I love the visual PowerPoints. I do. Puts the points like that, but I'm the generation that wants the paper.
Well, I have too. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Board member questions? Okay, we have the wrap-up here
Yes,
of
thank
the
you.
invited participants.
That's right.
At present, I have 4 additional after that, but we'll keep it quick. Oh,
Yeah.
I always know that of you, Mr. Katz.
Who needs no introduction? I just want to quickly say I had the pleasure of witnessing the now famous and proof of concept Nigiri project that was in partnership with Cal Trout and Jacob Katz. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you, Darren.
Morning.
Vice President Dolan, members of the board, pleasure to be back before you. I just want to speak a little bit about relationships and their...
Jacob, before you get started, could you state your name for the record, please? Thank you.
Of course. Jacob Katz, California Trout. I'm a senior scientist. Cal Trout, I think you all know, but is a 45-year-old conservation organization based here in California with offices throughout the state. I've had the pleasure of working in the Valley, growing up in the Valley, and working with the board for almost a decade now. It's a great honor, a privilege really to come behind my colleagues here. I think that they've really got at the content of recommendations about how we as a community can really come together to build a better system, a better flood system, a better water security, to improve water security, to fundamentally create a system that works for both the environment and for people in all of these fundamental and important ways that we've listed as multiple benefits. One of the other pieces I wanted to touch on was something that's really important to me and has been kind of the foundation of my experience with the flood board, and that is relationships, not just relationships as far as land use, relationships across disciplines, whether that be ag and flood and water supply, but the actual relationships between people. And in the run up to the 2017 update, the board had the vision to form an advisory committee, really under the leadership of Emma Suarez, who I'm sure we all miss deeply, and Clyde McDonald. A venue was created, and that was literally, years, actually, a year and a half almost of meetings in the windowless office below the JOC. Initially, I think everyone saw another meeting, another chance for people to talk at each other. But under Clyde and Emma's leadership, I think that really changed and changed quickly. And the venue that I think has had real impact in that it allowed people to look each other in the eye across tables, to get to know each other, to understand viscerally what it meant to think about flood from the other side of the table, from another perspective, to think about water supply, to understand how it all is connected with river function, with the patterns of flow, of water moving across the landscape. And many of our colleagues that I got to know in that are here today. Many couldn't make it, but working with the Flood Board, with Jack Rice and Justin Fredrickson, working with the Flood Association with Melinda Terry and Rick Reinhardt, working with the counties, Thomas Pate of Solano, Doug Brown representing YOLO, working with the incredible staff at DWR and here at with the board, with Mary Jimenez and Eric Sy, with Chris Chernell, with Mike Roberts. Those relationships, relationships with the regions, getting to know Barry Regan and Louis Bear, et cetera, that is what really allowed the space, the understanding, the collective movement forward to make the 2017, or at least to bring much of those that I know in not just tacit support, but enthusiastic support of that document. And I think it was those relationships and that feeling of actually understanding what multi-benefit meant, that it was going to be hard, that there was no precedent for really bringing together environmental planning and flood planning, for understanding the disadvantaged communities and their needs in the Central Valley, and how that had a really important nexus with our flood corridors, with our levees. All of that is much more than just talking about a chance to come together. It's the basis of resiliency. The resiliency is always based on diversity. We have that ingrained in our language, right? You can't have all your eggs in one basket, right? A diverse portfolio is the only way to move forward in investing, understanding that there is going to be diverse and unexpected market disturbances. It's absolutely the same thing in the environment. That diversity, when it comes to actually implementing the plan, when it comes to managing the landscape, is a diversity built on people, on relationships, on perspectives. And I think that the board has done a better job than any of the other public institutions working in water now to really form that common ground. And that common ground is now exactly what the governor needs a blueprint for, to establish on a wider statewide look at water resiliency and water portfolios. So I don't know exactly how to dissect how that success came about. I don't know that there's a bulleted list that's going to help, but I do know that it is your leadership and your continued leadership in pushing those kinds of multi-stakeholder, multi-constituency venues forward, that doing it in a real manner, taking difficult problems on the ground and bringing your network together with your support to do it. And one of the efforts I think that is really continuing that trajectory is the O&M work group that's happening right now in YOLO Bypass with Ruth, under the leadership of Ruth Darling and Mary Jimenez from DWR and Rick Reinhardt. There's a real opportunity now for us to not just mouth these words, multi-benefit, integration, but to actually figure out how they work, how we do this together on the ground. And it's not something that's going to happen in a bunch of policy recommendations, as much as we're willing to give those. It's things that are going to happen when we work together, when we know each other, when we know each other's problems, and when we actually move past pointing to what's wrong and have a real portfolio of solutions. And I think that right now, that's exactly where we in the Central Valley are. There's a real sense of understanding that we have to pivot away from single focus on any one of our perspectives. It can't be done by flood alone. It can't be done by conservation, restoration, environmental function alone. It can't be done from a water diversion and water supply way. It can't be done from environmental justice. That what we have the incredible capacity and the potential and really the honor to put forward is showing that floodplains have an ability to show us that we fundamentally altered the way that water flows across the landscape. That when we understand that, when we understand in a scientific context of what fundamental processes were interrupted, we can manage for those. We have a chance to really work with nature, to integrate a working knowledge of how the Central Valley works that was not present when the footprint of our system was built. And that opportunity is thrilling in a lot of ways. And I think you just heard many of the ways in which that can happen. I had a presentation which I just started playing that never came up. But I don't think I can talk without talking just briefly, giving the fish just a moment, a voice, which is to say that that flood is absolutely pivotal to the function of the way the system works. We think about it so often tied directly to either threat or protection, but the patterns of spreading water out and slowing it down are absolutely fundamental to the incredible productivity of this valley. Now, that productivity we tend to think of in agricultural terms now, but we have the capacity, we have the ability to reintegrate this incredible natural engine of productivity that also comes when you spread water out and slow it down. And now with rethinking the land use on our floodplains is a real choice to, yeah. I'm sorry, Jacob. We'll go with that. I think you've all seen pictures of small fish and big fish. You've all seen this idea that when you give native critters a chance to recognize the valley that they are adapted to, that they evolved with, that there is an incredible chance to have a different set of outcomes. And that's the one piece that I want to just to reiterate. It's that this multi-benefit approach allows us to understand that by integrating that working knowledge of how rivers work into the way we manage them, we have a chance to integrate the energy flow that actually builds robust populations of fish. And when we have greater populations of fish, we can relieve a regulatory burden that moves not just to thinking about flood protection and flood safety, but also to the varied nature of water security. We actually have a system that no longer needs to be at direct loggerheads on what's good for the environment versus what's good for water supply. And the dawning of that acknowledgement is exactly why, Metropolitan District of Southern California and San Luis Delta Mendota and even Westlands have come up and started to support this work in the Sacramento Valley as far as understanding that a working, functioning river system is what's going to allow us to fund, to permit, and ultimately to create a sustainable water supply for the state as a whole. Your leadership in that is absolutely pivotal, and I want to congratulate you and hope that we can together bring this model to the awareness of the administration and the state as a whole. So thank you very much. Thanks to this incredible partnership of NGOs. And then just one last piece is the relationships built with, I believe some of our colleagues want to come up here and talk as well. That is, as much as anything else, the recipe for success as we move forward. So thanks again.
Thank you for highlighting that. And of course, we appreciate the compliments, but thanks for underlying really,
I'm just here to flatter.
the goal, yeah, still, that's great. The goal and the mission of this board, I think I can speak for all of us, was to really engage a diversity of input and stakeholders so that we could achieve a plan that looked to the future and also met the statutory needs. But that can only be done with the willingness of people to engage. So thank you for that. We can invite, but unless you're willing to put in the work. So yes, we put together an advisory committee, but the members of it did an amazing job to bring forward a good plan. And I suspect that if our board president were actually here, and I wish he were, he would say, we have a plan to plan, and now it is our obligation to work with the stakeholders to see how we can implement it and not just have it be what we see as a very good idea for the future, but to get it in place.
Absolutely, and I think that we've set a really important trajectory, and now it's we get a chance to follow it. So
Thank you.
thank you.
We'll figure out how to get your presentation to the board. Okay, I'm feeling just a little bit of pressure here to have a break, but we're not going to do it until we hear from our extra folks, but then we will. I have 4 cards, and I'm going to call them in the order that they came up here. So, Mr. Reinhardt, you would be up. Anyone else who really feels the need to talk to us, get that card in now. And our board clerk said to remind you, you have 3 minutes.
I'll be quick. Thank you.
We'll see how you
Vice
go.
President Dolan, members of the board, Rick Reinhardt, here for the Flood Control Association. I want to reinforce a number of the points that I've heard today. Most importantly was from Jacob, and that's that the success of implementation of the plan is going to be built on the relationships that have been built across a broad coalition of flood control, environmental, and agricultural interests. And while we've done, I think, a tremendous job supporting your board and the Development 2017 update, now we need to shift to implementation. And that's what I'd really like to see the focus of the Water Resiliency Plan. I do have an ask for the board to consider, and that's that I haven't heard what form your product is going to take, of how you've considered this input, and how you put forth a product that considers what you've heard and aligns that with the opening remarks that President Edgar made. And so I'd ask that you consider forming a work group or some other venue to engage with your staff to bring something back to the board that it collects all the input that you've received from these listening sessions. Second, I'm glad we had an opportunity to spend some time on the San Joaquin today. One of the most important things the board did as part of the plan, in my opinion, was advancing our understanding of the science of climate change and what we might face in the future. I will say that on the San Joaquin system, the work that's been done on climate change isn't what I would put in the category as actionable science, meaning that it hasn't developed to the point that we have a good enough understanding of the projections that we're going to be able to make investment decisions. And so one of the priorities should be to continue to advance that, to shrink those error bands around so that we can make investment decisions. Second, one of the areas that we need to put some energy into is the San Joaquin Basin-wide feasibility study did not identify an alternative of how we would deal with that climate change scenario. That needs to be our focus. We're going to need to be able to plan for these larger floods. I will take exception to the words that Ms. Retner used, that maybe we don't reclaim the system after flood. I think there are certainly areas where we want to open back up to flooding, but we want a plan that anticipates those floods and that we control the flooding to the less vulnerable areas, and we make sure that it's not flooding especially the rural communities and the disadvantaged communities along the San Joaquin River system. And then lastly, want to emphasize Jacob's point about our O&M work group, that much of the multi-benefit discussion has been around project implementation and developing projects that were multi-benefit, but have not focused on how we operate and maintain these plans. Our operation and maintenance have a history of being in conflict with the regulatory process, with getting sufficient funding. We need to develop O&M plans that are managing the multiple benefits, that are targeting ecological uplift, and that are prioritizing public safety, and that have a secure funding stream. So thank you for the opportunity to reinforce those points.
Yes, thank you for that. very serious points to take into consideration as we move forward. I'm going to mess this one up, and I apologize. Deidre Desjardins? How close did I get?
That's pretty close. It's Desjardins, California Water Research. And I'm hoping to just go through the first few slides. I found a definition from the U.S. Water Alliance. I think we're talking about deep adaptation, and we're going to see, if we don't do this right, we're going to see an amazing amount of displacement and climate refugees in California, probably starting in about 30 years. That's the 1955 Stockton flood, just to give everybody an idea. This is the paper I found. It's by the U.S. Water Alliance. It's called An Equitable Water Future, a national briefing paper. They had a definition of water stress, and I think we need to look at that for the portfolio. Water stress, it can include inadequate access to drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater services, but it also encompasses water-related climate impacts such as floods, droughts, and rising sea levels. Water equity occurs when all communities not only have access to safe, clean, affordable drinking water and wastewater services, but are resilient in the face of floods, drought, and other climate risks. So I think these are just key definitions for the flood board. It's a national briefing paper. I did want to get a little bit more. I do think, I just want to say before I go on to droughts, that this is not CalFed. We're 20 years later, and the choices we make now are really about survival of these vulnerable populations. They're really about massive displacement. We really have to look at not building in areas we shouldn't be building and in areas that we are planning to continue building, that they have to be protected. For droughts, and as far as there being uncertainty in climate change projections, we're starting to get at least enough certainty about projections of future increases in floods to begin that kind of planning. It's never going to be perfect, but we've made an enormous amount of progress, and there's new research coming out, and it's all consistent. As there was a question about droughts, there is a significant issue with management of the State Water Project reservoirs. So this is South Fork of Lake Oroville. And I was stunned to discover that this is actually the plan. There's a State Water Project rule curve. It sets carryover storage targets. The State Water Project was originally managed to maintain deliveries in a repeat of the 29 to 34 drought. But the curve was changed in the mid-1980s. This is ironically a paper, and it shows the prior rule curve where they would try to maintain storage for a 6-year period, and they changed to a version of the new rule curve where they would take deliveries more aggressively and draw the total system storage down. And this was done based on the projection that 1 in 400 year, a 6-year drought would only occur 1 in 400 years. And they later found out that was wrong, and it's just never been changed back. But there need to be major changes in how our systems, our reservoirs are operated, not just for droughts, but also for floods. And we will need to increase storage capacity. We will need increased flood reservation space, and it's maybe possible to manage that with forecast-informed reservoir operations, but it's something that we very much need to be doing. Thank you.
Thank you for the information. Mr. O'Regan? And then after he speaks, Mr. Brown. I could still say good morning.
Good morning, Vice President Dolan, board members. Thank you for this opportunity to talk to you. I'll try not to be repetitive. Think of it just as a reiteration of some of the points that have been made earlier. You know, when we look at the challenges that are ahead of us, and also when we work in the day-to-day stuff that we all have to take care of, it's easy to forget how much progress we've made, really, when you think about how much we've done. We've made significant progress in envisioning what our flood control system should look like in the future, both through your plan and through the RFMP process. We've made significant projects and physical improvements to our system to reduce flood risk. We've spent a lot of dollars moving dirt, and that's great. But it's also worth noting that we've made significant progress in bringing together stakeholders from different groups, bringing together state and local agencies to cooperate on implementing the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan and Regional Flood Management Plan priorities, much to what previous speakers have spoken to. And without that cooperation, implementation of your plan is not going to occur. I'd like to remind the board that the regional flood management plans have been critical to the progress we've made to date and will remain critical to future progress. For example, the Mid and Upper Sac regional plan was able to leverage outside investment to develop a regional conservation investment strategy for our region. That regional investment conservation strategy will really help you and implement your plan, and also it'll help other agencies who want to do projects in that region. Without the RFMP, that regional conservation strategy would not have happened. Now, we brought together 7 different LMAs on the Sacramento River to develop a SWIFT that resulted in over $50 million in investment by the Corps of Engineers in our system. Without the regional flood management plan effort, that would not have happened. And $50 million in these rural areas, that's a huge number. Investment in reducing risk for those areas. I spent last week visiting communities in Vina, Gerber, Princeton, Colusa, talk about reducing flood risk through the Small Communities Program. And I talked to them about reducing flood risk, and they talked to me about the other challenges that they're facing. Increased water drinking standards, increased wastewater discharge standards, trying to keep their schools open. So when we go talk to them about flood risk, it's just one little thing that they have to deal with. These small communities are struggling very, very much. But there are opportunities in front of us that we think that we can continue to leverage to make improvements to the system. Many of the water agencies in the Sacramento Valley are moving forward with voluntary settlement, voluntary agreement projects that we think can be used to leverage and to implement some of the things that you've envisioned as part of your plan. And we think that the regional flood management plans are the ideal vehicle to ensure that these efforts are consistent and complementary to your vision for the flood control system. Many of these voluntary agreement type projects will require your support, both here and also at the state and the federal level, to move forward. But I think using the RFMPs to be your voice in that process will allow them to be, again, moving that ball forward that we're all trying to move forward. So thank you for taking the time this morning.
Thank you. Thank you for emphasizing prior work and what still needs to be done. Mr. Doug Brown.
Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to speak. I have to start out by saying, well, first, Doug Brown with Douglas Environmental. I'm here as a consultant working on the Lower Sacramento Delta North Regional Flood Management Plan effort. And I have to admit, I'm a little annoyed. I put some notes together, and then Jacob got up and hit most of those topics, and then Barry jumped up and got the last one. So I guess that's good because this will make it very short. I was going to emphasize the power of partnerships. Jacob said it as relationships. I think the advisory committee was a great example of that. I think the RFMPs are great examples of that. When you start looking at trying to implement multi-benefit projects, they are difficult and they're just hard. And in order to get those projects implemented, you need those relationships. You need the local relationships, you need the relationships with the state agencies, you need relationships with the NGOs. And the RFMP process has allowed those relationships to really develop and flourish. The advisory committee process allowed those relationships with the NGOs to flourish. An example that came to mind was some work that hasn't been mentioned, was some work we've done on the small communities, where we decided, based on Rick Reinhardt's suggestion, to pull in American Rivers on the consultant team to work on the small communities. And through that effort, we were able to identify some really innovative multi-benefit opportunities in the Knights Landing and Yolo communities that we think really enhanced those flood plans. And so the one thing I wanted to point out is, as far as the power of partnerships, we do have a partnership in place in the Yellow Bypass Cache Slough area. We know the flood board and your staff have been intimately involved in that process. We see the governor's resiliency portfolio as one of the principles in that is strengthening partnerships with local, federal, and tribal governments, water agencies, and irrigation districts, and other stakeholders. And we would encourage you to, as far as giving recommendations to the governor, to think about how that partnership, other partnerships, the work that we're all doing together can be strengthened, and how the state can focus through this water resiliency portfolio to make those relationships longer lasting and more effective. And with that, thank you for your time.
Thank you. That was a good kind of synopsis wrap-up.
Thank you, Vice President Dolan. So with that, I wanted to seek board direction. I would suggest that if I could compile or work with the Central Valley Flood Control Association and Kelly Cook over at Conservation Natural Resources Group, bringing together the comments for the flood group last month and the comments we heard today for something that, or rolling it into something that I could bring back next month for your adoption and approval. We can move that forward to Nancy Vogel with the Resources Agency to forward on to the governor.
That would be a good path forward. We had amazing input at our last meeting and amazing input today. So our thanks to everyone who puts forward such thoughtful presentations and comments for us. So now the challenge is for our staff to try to synthesize those into what our response will be to the agents, the secretaries, and then to the governor for our view of, as a Central Valley Flood Protection Board, for portfolio. Yeah, just think how you take what has been 4.5 hours of input and it's amazing into something that is a readable document and expresses our issues. I think the suggestions of bringing in some of our stakeholders for, whether we have time for actual work group, but certainly a work group conversation.
That's great. I think
We look forward to what you do.
Thanks. Well, I think it's highlighted by Mr. Katz and Mr. Brown earlier that the partnerships exist. I think now we just put pen to paper and we can support a document for you to.
Well, I think we heard enough from both sessions that we can begin by not overblowing, but just state the groundwork that has been laid in what is maybe not have been called portfolio, but multi-benefit and in the plan, and then how to proceed forward.
Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else? Mr. Ramirez?
Yeah, one quick thought. Whatever that process is, I would ask Leslie to find a way to get the board engaged also.
right.
I don't know how quickly it needs to be turned around, probably are behind schedule, but we heard a lot of great things the last couple of meetings, but this is a board package, right? So I want to make sure folks have a chance and find a way to comment and to weigh in. It's really great to listen, and I want to thank folks that came today and also last month. It's really useful and valuable to hear people's insights. It's hard just to listen. We haven't said anything yet. And at the risk of taking more time, which I don't want to do right now, in large part because we promised Jim we would never do this to him again, and we did it to him again and didn't give him a break. which I apologize for, but thank you for sticking with us. I also just wanted to take 30 seconds and say, I think folks all got up and said more or less the glass is half full, and we're on a good path. And I'd like to say that it could be a little more full, not that it's going to be half empty. It's a little sad to think that our best examples predate SB 5, the 2012, 2017 plan, and have taken 2 decades, and we're not done with some of them yet, especially on the San Joaquin side. And they're good examples because they set us on the path that we've been on for a very long time, and this is another point in time to take stock of where we are, where we want to go. But I can't help but think about stories I read recently about the LA River and how much interest there is right now to make changes there for all the same reasons. And they have so little choices. And I think they would love to have the challenges that we do, especially on the San Joaquin side, where most of the challenges are institutional. And we need to find a way to really recognize that area and that resource, the river, as an asset for all the people in the valley, in those towns, and in the state. And if we don't do that and have a better vision and specific vision of what it looks like in the 2022 plan, we will have failed. It can't be that general again. We can't wait any longer for the state, I think, to really step forward and suggest not just what could be adopted by people on the ground, but what needs to be done across the entire valley to make it better for all the reasons people outlined today. There's a lot of things happening, and it just begs for some resolution and some action.
Thank you.
Okay.
Silence says we need to take a break.
Thank you very
Which
much.
I agree. Now, in the past, our president says we're going to take a lunch break for 12 minutes. So hurry up. 35 minutes is what I say. It's just the noon hour, so we will reconvene to complete our agenda at 12:35.